Hey guys, this is Mitch with FinePointCGI, and today we're going to talk about how to build an inventory system inside of Godot. So we're going to go through the process of building out a base item. We're going to talk about how to use the Godot grid system to build a very simple interface. We're going to talk about how to drag and drop our inventory items. We're going to talk about how to drag items to the trash and get rid of them. And we're going to talk about how to create a scalable inventory system so that your items can be different than just a singular item. That's what I have in store for you guys today. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the first thing we have to do is we got to create a new scene. So we will come up here, we'll click on scene, new scene, and then we'll head over to user interface, and we're going to be building a user interface. This will be our inventory screen here. Now, of course, we can adjust this and style it and make it nice and pretty later, but let's at least get it fully functional and ready to go. So the first thing we would need to add, in a scroll container. If your inventory has a lot of slots in it, which in my case, mine's not going to, it doesn't need more than probably 20 spaces, you're going to want to have a scroll container. So I'm going to right click and add in a child node. We'll add in a scroll container. And we'll just throw this somewhere in the scene. So we'll just kind of put it, I don't know, about here seems fine. Maybe I'll center align it so it's actually at the center of our screen. And we can make it about yay big, give or take. Recenter it real quick. And then we can right click that and add in another child node. Now we're going to add in a node called the grid container. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to have objects in a grid shape. So if we right click and add in a button, I'll show you guys what I mean. So if we zoom in here and we duplicate this button 21 times, let's say, and we click on our grid container and we change our columns to 2 or to 3, you'll see how it reacts. It throws these guys out into a grid of 3, grid of 2, or grid of 1, or whatever we need it to be. So that's kind of the nice thing about a grid container. Now we do have some small issues. We need to make it so that our grids are actually a proper size because we have some funkiness going on here. You can see our buttons are actually supposed to be a lot larger than these little tiny dots here. So we can actually tell it under layout to change our container sizing to expand to the actual size. And we can come into our buttons and change our buttons minimum size. So if we come to layout, custom minimum size, we can make that something like 20 and 20. And granted, I'm not the best at interface stuff, so there may be a better way to handle this than custom minimum size, but I'm going to do that because I'm not fully sure of a better way to do it. Maybe we'll go with 40 by 40, and then we can basically just get rid of these buttons and then just duplicate this 20 times, and we can see how it looks. You can see our scroll bar actually coming in very well here, showing us we can scroll down. Now, of course, we can come into our grid container and change our columns so it matches up with our inventory size, and that's how we can approach it. Now, again, in my case, I really only need probably something about this big, give or take, so I'm going to stick with that, and I'll adjust my scroll container to match, and I will center align it like that. I think that will work. And the nice thing is if you wanted to add in something like a player model here where you're going to equip them and things like that, this is going to be really useful for that. Now, next, we can just go in and delete these guys. We don't need them. And I'm going to rename this as inventory. And now all we have to do is create a script here and we'll call it inventory.gd. So we have here our ready and our process functions. And basically, what we have to do is on ready, we need to get a hold of our grid container. So we need to get some kind of global reference to our grid container. We're going to be using it a lot because we're going to be populating and adding and moving objects around. So we always want to have a full reference to that object. So we'll come up here and just say var $equals $sign grid container is of type grid container, and we're gonna set that equal to something on our ready. So we'll say grid container is equal to $, grid container, and that will pull back our scroll container / grid container, and that'll set up our object. And now we need to populate this grid container with our empty slots. And that's where a function like populate buttons would come in. So let's create a function for that. So we'll say func populate buttons. And what we need to do is we need to basically loop through and create buttons based off of our own capacity. And this can be useful if you needed to make something like, hey, I only want them to have 20 inventory slots. Oh, they picked up a backpack, so now they have 40 inventory slots. This allows you to do that. So we'll just come in and go for I in 20. Then we need to instance some kind of object. And we don't actually have a object that we can instance, right? We don't have a button to instance. So let's create that button. So we'll go back to our 2D. We're going to right click our grid container. We're going to add in a child node, and we will add in a button here. And then we're going to name this button inventory button. And then we'll right click that, and we're going to design out this button. And really, I don't know if we need that under our grid container. Let's just go with this for now. We'll make it about, I don't know, about yay big, give or take. If we look at our layout here, we'll make the transform something like 40 by 40. Since we already kind of made that decision earlier, we said it was going to be 40 by 40. So we'll do that. And then for our custom minimum size, we'll just pick 40 by 40. And we have to come up with some constraints here. So what do we want our inventory button to do? Well, it needs to have a picture of our object that we are using or instancing or something like that. So for instance, if you have a key, right, you're going to want a picture of that key. We're going to want to label, if we have objects that we're stacking on top of each other, which in my case, we might with having matches or with having lantern fuel or something like that. So we need to have some kind of stack number. And then outside of that, we need to have some kind of way to detect if we're in that object. And I know a lot of people are saying, hey, you can just use this node control focus enter focus exit. But the problem that I don't like about focus enter and focus exit is that it never seems to work correctly for me. So I'm going to not use those. If you want to use them, of course, you're welcome to. And maybe someday I'll change over to focus entered or mouse entered. But in my case, I always have problems with them. We're going to need some way to detect whether or not the user is inside of this object here. So how we can set up our texture, we're going to right click, add in a child node, and add in a texture rect here. And we will make it full screen like that. So it snaps to the full size. And then we're going to drag in an icon SVG just to see what it looks like. And that is way too big. So what we can do is just adjust the size by hitting ignore texture size, and that'll snap it back to the proper size. And then all we have to do is come in and add in our label. So we'll right click, add in a child node, and add in a label like that. And I'm going to snap this to the bottom right. Most of the time in games that I've played, they've had it at the bottom right. So since this will be in the bottom right, we can hit something like 1, and you'll notice that it says 1, and it's a little on the large side, but we're going to need to do a custom font, and we'll have to do a whole styling pass of all of our interface anyway, so we won't get to that just yet. But what we can do is we can align this to the right. So if we have 100 of an object, it's going to be right here. If we have 1 of an object, it'll stay on the right side of this object. And I'll give it a little bit of a buffer so it has some space here. Now, once we have this, we have our text direct, we have our label. We're going to need a way to detect whether or not the mouse is inside of the object here. So we need to add in an area 2D. So we'll right click, add in a child node, and add in an area 2D. And we'll right click and add in a child node, and we'll add in a collision shape 2D as well. Because an area 2D doesn't work if you don't have a collision shape. It just doesn't handle it. It doesn't take any kind of collision event if you don't have some kind of shape. And a collision shape doesn't work if you don't actually assign a shape to it. So we'll give it a rectangular shape, and we'll snap this to about this big, give or take. So it's the size of the button. And I'll kind of make this just slightly smaller so it's out just inside of the actual object itself. And then I'm going to right click my inventory button and I'm going to attach a script and I'm going to call it inventory button.gd and I'll hit create. And here we go. We have ourselves a nice little button. Now we can attach our area 2D. So we'll do that on area entered and we'll attach that to our inventory button. We're going to do the same thing on area exit as well. So we'll attach both of those guys. So it's all hooked up here. Now, once we have our area button kind of created, now we can basically just code it. And I know that we're kind of going down a rabbit hole. We'll recurse back up to our inventory itself once we get this settled. But some of our use cases are pretty simple. What we have is we need to set up the ability to set our picture and set our label. And we need to have the ability to click on that button and use an item. So what we'll do is we'll come in and we'll set all those up. So first, we need to house a reference to an item. And we don't actually have an item yet, and we'll create that in a moment, but we'll hold a reference to that item. So we'll say var current item, and we will also have a link to our texture rect. So var icon, and then we need to have a link to our label. So var label. And it looks like icon doesn't work. So we'll say current icon and we'll just call this current label. Might as well just stick with that naming convention that we have here. And we're going to need to create a signal. Now in Godot, we have the ability to create custom signals, and custom signals are really useful. Much like how we have a signal here when we did our area 2D right here. Once we enter this area 2D, this signal will fire off and this code will catch it and run this little bit. We have to do the exact same thing here, but we have to define our own. So we have to actually build a custom signal. And signals are pretty easy to create. All you have to do is you come up here and you type signal and then you name your signal. So on button click. Like that. And then you say what you want to have put into this signal. Now, in my case, I want to have the index of our item and our item itself. Now, of course, we don't have any kind of item yet. Again, we will in a little bit. Once we have this, all we have to do is hook up our icon and our label. So we'll come into our ready and say current icon is equal to $ texture rect, and then current label is equal to $ label. And that's pretty much it here. Now, when you do your on button click, you need to actually invoke that on button click. And we have a button here. So we'll just say button down, and we'll just drop this on our inventory button. And we'll say on button down. And then we can just invoke our on button click. So we'll say emit signal and we'll say on button click, and we can pass in our different parameters right here. And in our case, we're going to pass in our item, and we'll need to pass in an index, which we don't have. So we'll say var index. Then we'll come down here and just say index, comma, item. And that will allow us to emit that signal and fire it off. And it's actually called current item. Like that. And that'll allow us to emit that signal. Now, we do have one other need. Now, we have one other thing we have to build, and that is our ability to update this button, right? This button, since it houses our label and our icon, we need to be able to kind of update this object with the new pictures and things like that as objects gets added or subtracted or moved around. So we'll just put func update item. We'll pass in an item and we'll pass in an index. And this is where we are going to get our stuff from our inventory. Our inventory is going to call update item, and then that's going to allow us to update all of our stuff. It's that simple. So we'll just say self.index is equal to index. And then we'll just say current item is equal to item. And that will do it for now. We're going to have to come back here and do some editing here because we still haven't set up our stuff, but we don't have anything for our item to work with. So I don't want to jump too far down the rabbit hole just yet. So once we have these guys, and I'm going to save this, I'll right click new folder and say UI, and we'll just drop in our inventory.tscn. Now, if we go back to our inventory needs to have something to populate, right? I spelled populate wrong. There we go. And that means that we need some kind of packed scene. So that means this guy here has to become a packed scene. So we'll right click, save branch as scene. We'll go into UI and we'll name it as inventory button, like so. And I prefer capital I for inventory, but it's up to you guys. And then we can now load that information. So we'll say var packed scene is equal to resource loader dot load, and we'll load in our inventory button, if I can find it. Inventory button like that. And that'll load that guy in as a pack scene. And then we can just say var item button is equal to packed scene dot instantiate. And that's going to instantiate that object and make it exist. And then we have to subscribe to that event. So for us to subscribe to our click event, we can just say item button dot connect, and we can connect our functions. Now we actually don't have a function to connect this to, so we'll just create a small adapter function. So we'll just say func on button clicked for right now, and we'll just say print clicked like so, and we'll just connect our signals together. So item button dot connect, and I'm not getting any auto completion, so I'm going to make this a typed button since that's the closest thing I have. And I'm going to see if I can get some auto completion here. Dot connect, and you'll see it says what signal, what name the signal is. So in our case, our signal is called on button click right here. So we'll paste that in. Comma, it's looking for a callable. So on button clicked like that. And we'll want to pass in our variables here. So we'll say on button clicked. And if you remember, our button here is passing an index and current item. So we'll do that. So we'll come over here, paste index current item. And that should just work for us. Now you'll see it says too few arguments, called expected to, but received 0. I forget if I need to do it this way. There we go. And that will do it. They changed how signals work a tiny bit in the new version of Godot, so it's kind of funky for me. And then we'll just add a child to our grid container. So $grid container.add child, and we'll pass in our item button. Now, if we're lucky, this should work. So we should just be able to come up here and say populate buttons, and that should hopefully work for us. Now, if I take and I delete my inventory button from my scene here, and I hit play and I click on run current scene, not play, it will hopefully populate 20 of those buttons. And that actually worked really well. You can see we have all 20, I believe. And that's all 20 right there, and they're buttons. And you can see we are firing off our click event when we click on them. Right here. Awesome. So that basically handles a lot of our code right here. So once we have this, all we have to do is come in and add objects to our inventory, which hopefully will be pretty simple. Now, what I'd like to do first is I'd like to come into my inventory button. So if I go to UI inventory button, and I take a look at it real quick, I don't want this label to have anything in it, because we verified that that's good. And I don't really need a texture rect in here either, because I want an empty button. I'm also going to make this just a touch smaller, like so. So that way we have, just for stylistic purposes, I want to have a little bit of space for my buttons so that they fit a little bit better. I'm also going to come into my inventory, go into my grid container, and I'm going to adjust the container spacing a tiny bit. So if we go to theme override constraints and I turn on H separation and V separation, I'm going to set this to something like 15 maybe. And that should help a little bit with some of the container sizing. Now we can test that by dragging in an inventory button and just duplicating it a few times. So if I just hit Control C, V, 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 which it's actually not doing what I wanted it to do. So let me that. Control duplicate. There we go. We duplicate this a few times. You'll see that we're getting a bit of a cutoff, and I don't like the spacing of this as much as I thought I would. So let's adjust the spacing down to something like 5 maybe. That might be a bit more reasonable. And then let's add all 20 of these objects. So 2, 4, actually I probably can just look at it right here. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And that looks pretty good to me. So we'll stick with that. I think that's good. So I'll delete these children nodes. I'll hit Control S on inventory, and I'm actually going to look at my inventory button, hit Control S so it saves. So now what it should look like is this, like that. And I think that will look good. Now, obviously, we're not going to see these area 2Ds, but that's fine. So I think that will work. So now we need to set it up so that we can actually add in objects and items. And that's going to call for us to build an actual reusable item object. And part of this system is to build something that's actually good, right? So we want to make it so that our item is reusable for the future. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to right click on my scripts. I'm going to create a new script and I'm going to make it inherit from a type resource. Godot resources are insane. If you haven't used them, or if you are not following the Godot horror game series, then this is probably somewhat new to you. A resource is basically a configurable piece of code that you can edit in your editor and have it reflect out in your game, which is really cool. So if we just create a script item.gd and make it inherit from resource and we hit create and then we open it really quick. So if I open this guy up and I go into item.gd, I'm going to have this thing extend from resources. That's fine. I'm going to say at export because you're going to want to export your stuff. I'm going to hit enter and we're going to need to decide what this thing has. So in my case, we have ID, name, resource path, icon, quantity, stack size, and if it's stackable. So I'll come in here and I'll create those variables. So at export var ID, and we'll make that a type int. And then we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to basically just duplicate this a few times. Go name as type string, our resource path as type string, our icon as a texture 2D. We have our quantity. We'll make that an integer. We have a stack size, and we'll make that an integer. And then we have whether or not it is stackable. So is stackable. We'll make that a type Boolean. And that should about do it. Now I know what you're asking. Okay, but what use is this to me? Here's where it gets cool. So if we come down here and I just come up to my RES and I right click and I say new resource, I can type in item. And if we're lucky, it will come up. I know some people have told me that it'll come up, but again, in my case, it doesn't seem to want to come up, and that's okay. But I'm curious. Let's try this. Class item. And let's try that and see if that does it. If we right click, new resource, item, see if it comes up. We'll add in a resource and we'll just say test item.tres, and we'll scroll down here and click on test item. And we will drag our item.gd onto this. And because this is a class, we need to get rid of that, Shift Tab, Control S, and then it will show up. And that's my fault. So unfortunately, a class doesn't work with a resource object. It won't show up in here. So we'll have to just not have that, and that's okay. So what we have here is an ID, so we can actually put an ID. So for instance, we could say this is item number 12. We can have a name in here, so we could say like this item is our test item. We can have a resource path where our test item is located. So for instance, if we're going to instance it into the scene, like if you have a key or something like that, you can go ahead and just instance it in using this resource path. Icon is great for an icon. And in our case, I'm just going to set that icon to icon.svg. We don't actually have a resource path, or else I would set one. And we do have an icon. And for quantity, we'll say 1, and our stack size is 5. And yes, it is in fact stackable. And once we have this and we're able to set up our stuff, all we have to do is make it so we can actually instance our items. So if we head back to our inventory here, we're going to need to set up some kind of button or something like that to kind of help us out here, at least temporarily, until we can actually, build out a system to, grab objects and put them in our inventory. Now, I'm just going to come into our inventory here on 2D. I'm going to right click, add a child node. I'm going to add in a button, and I'm going to make this about yay big. We'll drag it down here so we have it somewhere. And we'll just say add item. So we'll have this guy in here. We'll hook up a signal here. So we'll go to node, button down. We'll come in here. We'll hit connect. And then we'll basically just connect it to our inventory, and we'll add in our object. Now, we actually don't have a function specifically for that. So let's make one. We'll say func add, and we'll pass in an item. Now we just have to add our items. And basically, the easiest way to do it is we're going to pass in an item object. And then when we want to add that item, we basically just loop through our list of objects, inventory objects, and then we're going to add that object. Now, to do that, we're going to need to have an actual list of our objects that we have on hand, right? So we need to actually have some kind of inventory to hold these objects, some kind of array or list. So if we scroll up to the top here, we can just make one. So we'll say var items, and we'll make that a type array. So to add an item, all we have to do is basically just append it to our array. So we can just say items.append, and we can pass in our item, and we'll just throw that on top of our stack. And then we need to go and update our buttons with our item. And then we just need to update our button. Now, we don't have a function to update our button, and we could do it in here, but we may want to update our button elsewhere. For instance, if we were clearing out our inventory or deleting something, or maybe moving our inventory object to another section, we might want to update that button. So we'll make that into a function. So we'll say func update button, like that. And we'll pass in on our update button function, and we'll pass in our index, and that will be the type int. And then we can basically just say if size our index, and we'll probably need to pass in a range here. Items.size.has I, and if it has that index, then we know that we actually have an object in our array. So then we can just say, hey, go update that item. Now, thankfully, our grid container keeps an index of where all of our stuff is. So we can basically just say grid container.getChild, and we can pass in our index. So we can just say I dot, and we know that our button here has an update item right here. So we could just pass that in. So update item. And then we can just pass in our item. So we can pass in items I, comma, I. And that'll pass in our index, and that'll pass in our item. And I forgot it's supposed to be index, not I. There we go. So we'll do that, and that'll solve that. And then we can also check else if we don't have an item at that index, it's out of bounds, right? So we know that at that point, our object is actually null. So we basically can just grab our grid container and get our child and just pass in our index. And then we can update our item. And we'll pass in null and index. And that'll basically allow us to reset our item. So basically, if we pass in a proper item and we pass in a proper index, then we know we're good. So then we can just say, cool, we're good. We're going to get our child of that index. We're going to drop it in here, update it, and set its image and amount right there. If not, then we're going to take our index and we're going to say, hey, you have nothing. And then our update function will handle that nothing and update to be empty. That means that we have to go back to our update item inside of our inventory here. So if we go to our inventory button.gd, all we're doing here is we're just setting our index. It'd be really good if we could actually set our stuff up. So if we come in here, we could basically just check if our current item is equal to null, then we know that it's empty. So we can just set our icon.texture equal to null, and then we can also set our quantity label. So I believe we have our current label here, .text equal to empty, like that. Else, if it's not null, then we know that we actually have an icon here. So we can just go current icon.texture is equal to item.icon. And then we can do the same thing with our label. So current label.text is equal to item.quantity. Like that. And I believe my icon is capital I and capital Q. Let me check real quick. That way we don't make a mistake here. Icon, quantity, capital Q, capital I, and that's fine. I, capital Q. Cool. So hopefully, if we press on that button, it will actually work. So if we head back here, you can see we have our little function right here. We could just call add item. So we could just say add, and we can pass in our item. Now we don't actually have an item to pass in, except for we actually do. We have our res object right here, this little test item that we built right here. So if we're lucky, this should work. So all we have to do is resource load it. So resource loader.load, and we'll pass in our test item, providing it wants me to, res // test item.tres. So this will come out, it'll run our add, and then we'll come up here and we'll just append it to our array. Now we need to do a little bit more than just append it to our array, right? We need to actually add it to our button. So we can just come in here and say update button, and we can pass in our items size -1. And that'll basically just grab our item size, get the last index, and then add it to our stuff. So that should work. So if we hit play and then we hit add, we have a breakpoint here. So we got our icon, we set our texture, our current label to quantity, cannot set text to value type int. That's because this needs to be cast as a string. So str. So we'll pass in a string like this, and we'll save it. We'll refresh it and we'll try it one more time. So add item. You will see that we have our item. And if we click add again, we have a second one. And we could just keep doing that until our inventory is full. Now, this is cool. And you can see we can click on them and it says clicked, which is exciting as well. Now, something that you'll notice is our stack size on our test item, if we double click on it, is supposed to be 5. And our stack on our actual ran code here is only 1. So it should just append on top of it. So how do we get it to do that? Well, all we have to do is loop through all of our objects and then check its quantity. And then if we can determine if its quantity is lower than the value, than the stack size, then we know that we can append it. So if we come into our add, which would be under our inventory here, when we update our button, instead of doing it right here, above here, we'll just come in and say for I in items. Then we'll check if our items I.id is equal to our item.id. And we don't want to stack it if it's more than what our item actually can have. So items I.quantity does not equal items I.stack size. Like that. Okay. And what we're doing is we're basically saying, hey, does this object's ID equal to my item's ID? Now, the reason why we're doing this is because we don't want our object to append to the stack size of another object, because that can cause a lot of problems. So we don't want to do that. And we don't want to append to our stack size if our stack size is higher than if our quantity is higher than our stack size, because it makes it so that we could have, 40 items when our stack size is only 20. So it basically allows us to say, hey, there's an upper echelon here that we can do. And of course, if you don't want that, you can disable this and it will solve that, of course. And then we have to check if our items I.quantity plus our item.quantity is greater than our items I.stack size. Now, what this does is basically we're saying, hey, if this plus this is bigger than what our stack size is, then we're going to need to split these two. We can't allow you to go above what our stack size would be. So we'll just grab our stuff and say, hey, items I.quantity is equal to item.stack size. And then we have to set our item.quantity equal to minus our item.quantity minus items I.stack size. And what that's going to do is basically we're saying, hey, not equals, minus. Basically what we're doing is we're saying, hey, take our quantity, make it equal to our quantity minus our stack size. And this is going to be inverted. So it's going to be a minus whatever that is. Now you could flip these two minuses as well, and that technically would solve this. But I like to be fancy, so I just did it this way. And then what we'll do is we'll say update button like that, and we'll pass in our index, which will be I. If our quantity plus our quantity is not greater than our stack size, then what else can we do? Well, else we can basically say, hey, yo, we're good. So item I.quantity plus equals our item.quantity. And then we can just set our item.quantity equal to 0. And then we could just update our button with our index. Now, if you wanted to, you could probably just throw this guy in here if you want to, but I think that'll be okay. And now, outside of this for loop, so basically we've looped through all of our things and have said, hey, if you exist, either add it and then keep the leftovers, or just add it. If all of that's completed, we might still have some stuff left over, right? Up here, we have a section here where we're minusing our quantity. There's a possibility that more data could be there, or more objects could be there than what we expected. We need to check for that. So we'll say if our item.quantity is greater than 0, then we need to make sure that we account for that, because we don't want to lose items into the ether, right? We could just grab it and say, hey, if our item.quantity is less than our item.stack size, then we know that we're good and we're solid. So we can just go ahead and say items dot append, and we can pass in our item. And then we can just update our button, much like we're doing right here. Simple enough. Oh, and I closed this by accident. There we go. However, what happens if we're passing just a boatload of stuff? What happens if we only allow for 5 and we're passing, 15? That means we have to use recursion. We have to call ourselves to kind of handle those additional objects. So we could just say else items.add.append, and we can append our item, right? But if we do this, we're going to append all those 20 items, right? Or one slot of those 20 items instead of 4 slots. So this is where we need to break up our item into a piece. We can come up here and just say var temp item is equal to our current item, like so. And then we could just put our temp item dot quantity equal to our item dot stack size. Need to put capital Q for quantity. And then we can just append that temp item like that. Then we have to update our button like so, much like we did earlier with items.size -1. And then we can grab our item.quantity minus equals our item.stack size. And then we can just call our add one more time. So we'll say add, and we'll just add our item again. And if everything's done correctly, that should work. So now if we refresh this, hopefully everything will go smoothly. So add an item, and we immediately have a crash. So that's always an awesome sign. So first things first, items I, for I and items.append I. Well, first we don't want to append our item. So that's my fault. But it's mad because it's unable to get index resource on array. Take a look at this. We got an array of one item, which is this guy here. So I know I can get rid of this guy. I don't need to deal with that. But invalid index. I think we'll need to do items.size instead of just items, because I think it's pulling back the object reference, not the actual index. Let's try that again. So we'll add an item. You'll see we have one. We'll hit add again. We have another crash, which is always good. Invalid index 0 on base resource. That's because this should be items, not item. So that's good. Let's see if we have any more of those mistakes. Items, items, item. Really, we should rename our item to current item instead, or something like that. That would probably help with making this a little bit less confusing, but I think we'll be okay for right now. Let's try that one more time. So we'll hit add, 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 and we're at 0. So that's also not great. So let's start stepping through this for real quick. So we'll hit add item, items.size. We're going to lop off our first index. We're going to see that our stack size plus item quantity is not higher. So we'll add it. Items.quantity is plus equals item.quantity. So items I, see. We have a quantity of 0, which isn't ideal. Did I set this to 0? No, I set it to 1. My only guess is that I need to copy this item. So what I'll do is I'll go var current item is equal to item dot. I'm curious if I can do item dot. If I make this a type resource like that, and I say equal to item dot, let's see if I have any duplicate. Let's see what search help does. We got a duplicate function. Duplicates node, returns new node. I think this will do what we need it to do. So I'll come in here and I'll go dot duplicate, and I will put in sub resource. Let's take a look at the documentation real quick. Okay, well, we can try it and see what it does. So dot duplicate, and then instead of doing item, we'll use current item. I'll come into search, replace item with current item, and I'll just come in here and just replace and match the whole word. Replace, 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 replace. This guy is also in there, so replace, 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 replace. Let's see if that does better. Let's see what that does. So we'll hit play. And there we go. So now we got a 2, 3, 4, 5. Our stack size is 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Stack size 5. Nice. So what happens if we set our quantity to something like 15 and we hit play with our stack size being 5? Well, that's not quite what I was expecting, so that's not ideal. Maybe it didn't save, maybe it did, so we'll try it. Well, it's not quite what we had in mind, so let's come in here, put a breakpoint in, hit play, hit add. Let's see what it does. So we'll come in here. Current item quantity is greater than 0. Cool. Current item quantity is not less than. So it comes in here, creates a temp item. But I think we need to do a dot duplicate like so. Let's try that. There we go. That's what we're looking for. It's because we didn't break that reference here. So one of the things that I've learned about coding in general is a lot of times when you make an object equal to another object, you're making it equal to a reference of that object. You're not actually making it equal to that object and making a duplication of that object. It's a way to help with memory. So you're basically saying, make a pointer to this object so that way it's a little bit easier on your memory. But in this case, we want it to be duplicated because we don't want to have that quantity get updated on our base object, if that makes sense. So now, once we have this, we have our adding system done. Now we just need to do the same thing, but for removing. So to remove an item, all we really need to do is basically just make a function like we have for our add item. So we'll come in here and we'll just type func remove, and we'll pass in our item, and we'll make that a type resource just like we did above. And then all we have to do is basically just say, hey, remove this item. So we'll make a copy of our item like we did before. So we'll say var current item is equal to item. And then we'll just loop through our inventory items. So for I in items dot count, if items I dot ID is equal to our current item dot ID, we'll need to make sure that we capitalize these guys. So ID like that. Then if it is that ID, then we know that we can delete it, right? So we'll just basically say minus equals our quantity, right? So much like we did where we added our quantity here, we can do the same thing. However, we can't just remove a singular item without checking if it actually has enough for us to delete. So we have to check for that. So if our items I dot quantity minus our current item dot quantity, and if that is less than 0, then we want to remove the item from our list, right? So we'll say current item dot quantity minus equals items I dot quantity. And then we'll say items I dot quantity is equal to 0. And that'll basically allow us to delete that stuff. And then I'm just going to update my button so that way we have something that we can see. You don't necessarily have to do this because we're going to be deleting our buttons and doing kind of like a little reflow script, but I don't really want to, I want to be able to see what it looks like while we're doing it. And we also need to do equal equal, not just equal. Else, this means that we can afford it, okay? So basically we're saying if we can't afford it with a singular cell of our inventory, then it takes up more than one, right? Else, this means that we can afford it within our singular cell. So we'll just say items I dot quantity minus equals our current item dot quantity. And then our current item dot quantity is equal to 0. Then we can just update our button from there. Like that, and we'll just pass an I. Now you'll notice that basically we're doing one of two things. We're either setting our current item quantity to 0 or we're setting our items quantity to 0. And that is because down here, what we'll do is we're going to check if our current item dot quantity is less than or equal to 0, then we know that we're good, so we can break. And if not, then we're going to continue looping through this. We're going to continue running through this until we actually have 0. So hopefully this will work for us. Now we do have a small issue here. We're doing for I in items.count. It says too few arguments, so it's because it's .size. My C# knowledge is coming back to bite me a little bit. And then what we have to do is we need to basically remove any instance of our items that are empty. So we'll basically just loop through our items and then remove them. Unfortunately, we don't really have a link where we can just say go remove everything where x is equal to 0, right? So we have to kind of basically loop through it and do it manually. So for I in items.size, then we can say if items I dot quantity is equal to 0, then we can basically say items dot remove at I. Now this unfortunately will not work. The reason why I'm showing you this is just because this is your immediate thought is, hey, I'm going to do it this way. But you can't just iterate through something and then remove things from that thing you're iterating on. So when you're looping through this, if you change your items.size, it's going to completely brick everything. You'll be missing indexes and things will get funky really, really fast. So we need to duplicate our items array. So we'll say var temp items is equal to items.duplicate. And that'll basically allow us to just duplicate that. And then we can just say temp items.size instead. That way we can iterate through our array without causing problems on our actual object. Then once we've removed everything, we can go through and reflow our buttons. Now, we don't actually have a function to reflow our buttons, but basically what reflowing our buttons is going to do is it's going to basically say, hey, all of the buttons in our entire inventory, go ahead and update. And that just allows us to make sure that everything's copacetic within our inventory. We don't necessarily have to do this, but I prefer to just make sure everything's settled when we delete an object. Adding an object is different than deleting an object. When you add an object, you're appending to an array. When you're deleting an object, you're pulling it out of that array. So a lot of times things can get really funky, especially when it comes to updating your interface. So it's always a good idea just to make sure stuff has been updated. So we'll just throw a func in here and we'll say reflow buttons. And what we'll do is just say for I in 20, because that's our capacity. And honestly, if we're going to make this into a good module for us to use in the future, we'll come up here and just come in here and just say var capacity is equal to 20. That way we actually just have a thing that says, hey, we have 20 and we're good to go. And then we can come in here for our populate buttons and say capacity. And we can come down here and do the same thing. Instead of 20, just capacity. That way in the future, if we want to add 40 or 100 items here, we can. We don't have to worry about it. So for I in capacity, update button, I. Now, if we've done everything correctly, it should just go and wipe all of the buttons if they're gone. And then we can just come in here and say reflow buttons like that. And hopefully that will do it for us. So we'll come in, we'll hit play. And we actually forgot to put in a button for that. So let me duplicate this button and let me come in here and remove item. And then let me come in here and go into my node, disconnect this, connect it to my inventory. And then let's go remove resource loader dot load, and we'll pass in res // test item dot tres. And I believe we actually called it capital R remove. Yep, we did. So capital R remove, and we'll hit play and we'll see what happens. So if we have them on top of each other, because I'm dumb, so we'll click on our button and let's move it over so it's not on top of it. And we'll hit play. If we hit add, we'll add 3. If we hit remove, we have a crash. So that's good. Kind of. Invalid operands, Boolean on int operator less than. So if items minus, oh, that's because I did equals, not minus. So we'll say minus current quantity. Let's try that again. So add items, remove, and we have a crash. Invalid index 2 on base array. So this is where we're going through and looping through our stuff. So I thought hopefully items 2, I guess because we're removing, or I'm guessing what, we have one item left. Yeah, we have one item left. So we're removing at, let me see, temp items dot size. So instead, I'm curious if can you iterate through arrays inside of Godot? If not, we're going to have to do some funkiness here. I didn't think so, because now it's going to get mad at me because I'm iterating through. I have 2, quantity is equal to 0 as it is, and my iteration is 3. So we could come in here and say var offset is equal to 0. And then if we delete something, we can just say offset minus equals 1. And then we can say items minus offset. And that might work. Let's try that. Invalid index 2 on base array. Okay, I think I know what's going on. So we need to take, let's take this guy. I haven't tested this fully, but let's take this guy, drop it down below here. I think my offset is causing a problem. I think it needs to be below this guy. So let's try that. And let's see what that does. So I'm going to uncheck these guys. I'm going to pull this guy over. Add, remove. There we go. That's what we're looking for. Cool. So now what happens if we come in here to our test item.tres and we set our quantity down to something like 2. And I make sure I click off of it, because you have to click off of it or else it's not going to be happy. Remove. That's not quite what I wanted. I'm curious if it's because I didn't reflow this. Let's add, subtract. 4, 2, gone, 2. Awesome. So we basically have our add and remove functions completed. So now you can basically add objects and remove them without having a single problem. Now all we have to do is figure out how to click and drag our objects. And then from there, we can swap our objects and move them around our inventory. So what we'll do is we're going to need to create some kind of way to know we're over an object. And how I think we're going to do that is we're going to come into our inventory. We're going to right click, add in a child node, and let's add in a area 2D. And let's right click that, add in a child node. Let's add in a collision shape 2D as well. And we'll make that into a small circular shape like so. If we focus in on that real quick, it's going to be a really small shape like this. We'll attach our area node on area entered. And we actually should name this mouse area. And we'll say on area entered, go to our inventory and do the same thing on area exited. We'll drop that onto our inventory. Basically, what these two are going to do is our area 2D is going to follow our mouse. And basically, we're going to, as soon as it enters our buttons area, which we set up, I think, we head over to our inventory button. Right here, you'll see we have an area 2D. So basically, we're going to say, hey, when we enter this area, we know that we are inside of that button. So we'll come up to the top and we'll have a global reference to whatever button we're currently over. So if we come up here and say var hovered button, and we'll also need one for our grabbed button as well. So while we're up here, we'll just add it like that. And when we're down here, we'll just say hovered button is equal to area dot get parent. And that'll fetch the parent of our mouse area, or I guess in this case of our inventory button. So it'll grab this guy and grab the parent, which will be our button itself. And then we can basically just do the same thing, except for the opposite with our exit. We can just come in here and say hovered button is equal to null. And that'll allow us to null that out so then we don't have to worry about it. Now, once we have that reference, we need to set it up so that our area here follows our mouse. I guess not this area, this mouse area here. We come up here into our process, we could basically just have it follow our mouse. So we'll just say $mouse area dot position is equal to get tree dot root dot get mouse position. And that'll allow it to follow my mouse. And then we need to know if we're over a hovered button. So if hovered button does not equal null, then we can actually do the rest of our code here. So we know that our mouse is over top of a button. So now we have to determine when we click on a button, we need to be able to click, drag it, and let go, right? For us to be able to move it from one spot to another. So that means that we're going to need to check for that input action. Now, I know that you could just do underscore input and create a function for that, but in my case, I'll just do it in process. Then everything kind of just runs off of frame time and it's a little bit easier. It's up to you guys if you guys want to drop it into its own function. So I'll just say if input dot is action just pressed, and I will say throw, because for us, clicking is the throw button. We have it defined right here in our project settings. So if you're not following the tutorial series and you're just following this for our actual project, you'll need to create a throw button here, or just name it as mouse button down or something like that. But you'll need to put something like that right here. So we'll say on throw, then we know that we've grabbed that object. So we'll say grabbed button is equal to hover button. And then we need to keep track of our clicked position. And the reason why is because how do you know the difference between if you've clicked something, like I want to select this thing, or if you're clicking to move it, to drag it? Well, the only way to know the difference is to keep track of where your mouse is. If you just click on it and your mouse doesn't move, then we know that you are not intending to move it, you're just intending to click on it. So that's why we're going to get our mouse position. We'll come up here and say var last clicked mouse pause, and we will set that as a vector 2, like that. Then we'll come down here and basically all we got to do is just say last clicked mouse position is equal to get tree dot root dot get mouse position, like that. And then we know that, okay, so we've just clicked it. We have our last mouse position. We have our grabbed object. Now we have to check if we're dragging our object, right? So if we're clicking it and we're dragging it, then we know for a fact that you're moving this object. And this is where things are going to get a little on the funkier side. So first we need to check our distance, because we need to know if we're dragging this object. So if last clicked mouse position dot distance to our get tree dot root dot get mouse position, if all of that is greater than 2, then we can go ahead and say, yep, they're dragging our thing. So now we can just check if our input dot is action pressed throw, then we know that you are still holding onto that button. Remember, throw is our click. So if you have your button clicked and you are holding onto it and you've moved further than 2 units away, then we can guarantee you that you're dragging that object, that you're actually moving it. Now, this is where things get fun. So first, we have to create a variable, var button is equal to, and we need some kind of button. Now, we do have an inventory button, and we want it to basically drag our button around. But we don't want to just take our button out of our grid container, because if you do that, you're going to mess up your whole stack, right? Your grid container operates on a list of objects that are perfectly set in an index, right? So you have like my first object, my second object, my third object. You take the third object out of that stack, right? Any objects below it are going to move up an index, and it's going to mess all of your code up. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take that button, we're going to duplicate it, so that way it is duplicated onto your hand, right, onto your mouse, and then we can actually go in and have everything work. So under our mouse area, let's just drag an inventory button underneath it like so, and hide it. And then we can come in here and just say $ inventory button. So mouse area inventory button dot show, and that'll tell it to show up. And then we could just say $mouse area inventory button dot update item, and we can pass in our grabbed object like that, dot current item, comma, and our index is 0 because we don't really have an index. And now if we hit play, you'll see what I'm kind of doing here. So if we hit add, and we drag, and it's mad at me, unvalid index current item. So grab button dot current item. Did we not call it current item? Let's see, inventory. All right, so I think I figured it out. So what was going on is my collision shape of my actual mouse area was just a little bit too large. So because of that, it was causing problems with having us in between multiple pieces here. And I just hit play, not play scene. So I can show you guys. So see how much smaller this one is? And basically when we were like here, we would get multiple entry points, and it would cause problems where it would say, we're grabbing this one, not this one. So now if we just hit add and we click and drag, we now have our 5 right here like we expect. If we click add and we grab our 2, you'll see it grabs our 2. So awesome. That's what we wanted. So now all we have to do is build out our switching code. So for us to do that, let's head back to our inventory and let's take a look at it. So you can see that we are clicking, dragging, we're updating our item here. Now we need to basically say, hey, if we are grabbing our item and we let off of our item, then we can go ahead and let go of the object. We could just say if input dot is underscore action just released. I'm going to throw a pass in here and see what's going on with my auto completion. I think it's these additional tabs here. Let's take care of those real quick. See if that solves our issue. Oh, that's because I have a pass right here. So something got a little on the funky side. So let me clean this up a tiny bit. There we go. See if that helps. So if action just released quote, and then of course we're going to release our row button, and we should be able to start our code right here, providing that it wants me to. Just released. There we go. For some reason, my IntelliSense wasn't working, so that made things a little bit more difficult. But now all we have to do is just swap our buttons. Now, I'm going to create an adapter function specifically for that to swap our buttons. And the reason why is because there's a possibility in the future that we might want to swap our buttons for a different purpose. We might want to call it somewhere else. So I'm just going to create a function called swap buttons like that. And I'm going to pass in my grabbed button and my hover over button. And then we're going to need to hide our button. So I'm just going to grab this guy because we have to hide our button. And we'll hit dot hide like that. And now I could just create a function called swap buttons. So we'll come in here, func swap buttons. And I will just come in here and say button 1, comma, button 2. And when we do our swap, it's going to be pretty simple. We basically need to pull back the index of our button. And then we need to basically tell our grid container to move our child. So we'll just grab a var and we'll call it button 1 index. And we'll make that equal to button 1 dot get index. And that's going to pull back the index of our button in our grid container stack. And then we'll do the same thing, but with button 2. So button 2 dot index, button 2 dot index, and then we'll just grab our grid container dot move child, and we'll pass in our node, which will be button 1, comma, and then our index, which will be button 2 index. And then we'll do the same thing, grid container dot move child, button 2, comma, button 1 index. And this should work. So we'll hit play. We'll come in here. We'll add a couple of items like so. We'll drag this guy here. You'll see he comes down, comes across, comes across. We can swap them. And there we go. And that's it. Now, I know some of you might think that, well, why don't we just take this index here and move it here? And why don't we take this index here and move it here, right? So we can have our stuff in the as just a compacted code. Why do we have these variables? Well, the reason why is because when we set our indexes, as soon as we move our index around, it's going to mess up this get index. So think of it kind of like this. When this guy moves to an index from 2 to 3, and this guy is supposed to move from 3 to 2, when this guy moves to 3, this is going to automatically move to 2, and then it's going to say, hey, I need you to go to the 3rd index, and it's going to be completely wrong. So basically, it just messes everything off and it gives you an off by 1 issue, or potentially off by many, depending. So that's why we have to create those variables there. And that's basically how we can do our drag and drop system. It's really that simple. So we can just add a couple, and now we actually have a full drag and drop system that does work. It does have some finickiness, and my guess is it has to do with when you take an object and you drag it off and there's not something to let up off of. So we're probably going to need to fix that use case. So if we come up here and we take a look, if you let go of your throw button and this is shown, I think that'll probably be the best way to do it. So we'll come in here and say if input dot is action just released, and we'll pass in our throw like so. Then we'll also check if our mouse area inventory button dot, I believe it's called dot hidden. Actually, I think that's a signal. Let's take a look. If we take a look at our inventory button, I believe they have a section in here that is visibility visible. So dot visible. Then we'll just grab this and hide it. So that way it gets rid of that little use case. And then we can also put our grabbed button equal to null. That way it just automatically resets it if the person lets off of it. And that way it shouldn't have, hopefully, an issue. Now we can hit play. We can add a couple items. We can drag it over here. And it did not do what I wanted it to do. If hovered over button does not equal null, that's why, because our hover over button is null. So we'll do that. We'll just drag these guys back one, and let's test that real quick. There you go. So now you can't make that mistake of, oh, I dragged it out. It doesn't affect it any, which is good. Now, of course, if you wanted to throw it away by dragging it out of your inventory, you could actually set this up so that instead of hiding, it just trashes the object. But speaking of trashing, let's talk about getting rid of the object. So if you want to delete it from your inventory, how do you delete something from your inventory? And it's pretty simple. It's actually easier than you might guess. So what we have to do is we have to do some finagling. And I'm just organizing my code a tiny bit because my code's a little bit of a mess. So what you have to do to get it to click and drag stuff out to a trash is first we have to create an actual trash. And for us to create a trash, it'll be pretty simple. We're basically just going to come into our 2D scene here. We'll go to our inventory, which is right over here. We'll select our scroll container. I'm going to drop a panel background on our scroll container. That way we just have something here to work with. So I'm going to come into our inventory, add it, panel, and I think I can just drop in a theme and drop in a style box flat just to have it have some color. We'll make it black or maybe like a neutral black. And then we'll just kind of drop it in here. We drop it in our scroll container and we make it full rect. What is that going to do? Literally nothing because scroll container doesn't allow for that. That's okay. So we'll make it just a touch bit bigger like so. And we'll try to match up our scroll container here. I know I'm not exactly doing it the most ideal way, but that's okay. Make it about yay big, and that should help with making it look good. Well, it's a little off, so we'll adjust it real quick. Move it over to make it a little bit bigger. There we go. And we'll make it a little frosted glassy. And I know that you guys probably don't care about this as much, but I just want to make it look halfway decent. And by halfway decent, I mean probably worse than what it looked like beforehand. But that's okay. We'll just kind of do this. And I think that looks okay. And now I'm going to add in a trash button. So we're going to right click, add in our inventory, add in a button. And I'm going to make it about this big, give or take. We'll drag it down here and we'll make it about this big, give or take. And I'm going to add in an area 2D. So area 2D, and I'm going to add in a collision shape because an area 2D won't work without a collision shape. And then I'm going to make that into a rectangular shape. I'm going to make it about yay big, give or take. And if we drag our scroll container up just a tiny bit, that way we have a small little shelf here for this. I can come in here, I can grab my area 2D, and I'm going to name it trash area. Now, of course, you don't have to have a button here. I just do because I like the look of the buttons and I feel like that works. It's up to you guys. You could probably just have an icon if you prefer, but it's up to you. And our trash area, I'm just going to name our button trash, or maybe just T for trash because I don't want to deal with sizing issues. We click on our trash issue, we click on our trash object and we go area entered and we drop it in on our signal. And we do the same thing with exit on area exit. We select this and connect it. Now we have our two signals and we're basically going to use these two signals to tell Godot that we are over our trash. So what we'll do is we'll come up here and create a Boolean. So we'll say var over trash, and I'm going to make that a lowercase o because this is going to be a private variable, and we'll make that a Boolean. We'll come down here and we'll basically just say when you enter this, you are over the trash. And if not, then you are over trash is equal to false. Just like that. And then all we have to do is we have to hook up some of our code to handle that over trash capability. So up here on our input events here, we have this action just released, and this is visible. Well, we can also check right here if over trash, then we can delete our item. Now, we can't just straight up delete our item because if I remember correctly, let's take a look at our inventory button. We do have a current item, so I guess we could try removing it. I'm thinking out loud right now. But I think we might have to build an adapter function, like a function that just kind of does our thing. But let's try remove, and we'll pass in grabbed button dot, and I believe it is called current item. So we'll pull that right there and we'll see if that works. Hopefully it does. We'll see. So we'll come in here, we'll add a couple of items, and then I will drag this guy down here. I will let go. And it didn't quite do what I had hoped. And I am getting an error. So that's always a good sign. At least there's something. Input child is not child of this node. That shouldn't have fired off, I don't think. Because we're swapping our button. But that's because our last click position is done like that. Let's see. That means that we're going to need to have some checks here as well. So we would need to say if over trash, then remove grabbed button dot current item, and then else this bit of code here. We can try that and see what that does. So, okay, so that's not ideal. Grabbed button dot current item is nil. But how would it get? Oh, because I have grabbed button is equal to null. So this would need to come down here. We can try that again. So let's refresh. 1, 2, 3. Drag this guy in. Let go. And that's not quite what we're looking for because it's deleting all of that. Let's take a look at what remove does. Yeah, so unfortunately, remove is not going to be able to do what we want it to do. So we're going to need to actually build another function, unfortunately. So we'll come in here and we'll say func delete button. And we'll allow you to pass in a button object here. And what we'll do is we'll say items dot remove at items dot find like that, and we'll find our button dot current item, and then we'll reflow our buttons, and then we will come in here and hide our grabbed button. So we'll just say $inventory button dot hide. We'll just grab that guy, drop it in. And then we should just be able to say, okay, if we're over trash, well, technically we don't need to do this. It's already hiding it for us. And then we could just say delete button right here. Like that. And let's see if that does better. We can also do the same thing up here. We'll want to pass in our button instead. I mean, technically we could do grabbed, instead we could just do the item itself, but I figured the button would be a little bit more reasonable to work with. We'll try that. And there we go. Now, if we put a breakpoint right here before it removes those items, let's make sure it's getting removed from our stack. So we'll check our items. And yeah, it looks like it's deleting them. And it's deleting them properly. Cool. So that works. Awesome. Now we have one last thing that we have to do. And this tutorial is probably an hour and a half long at this point. But we have one last thing we have to do. And that is when you click on a button, we just need to make it so that it fires off whatever that item's thing is. Now, I want to make this generic because a lot of times things can get finicky with inventory systems. And we'll probably need a part 2 on this when we start actually like creating puzzles and stuff. But basically, when we do our on button click, I'm just going to say current item dot use item. And basically, that's going to allow us to be generic. And what I mean by that is we have our item.gd. We can just come in here and say item use item func use item. And then we can just put in whatever kind of code we want here. So I'll just say print used item. Oops. And that should work. So if we come in here and we add in some stuff and we click, you'll see we have used item. Now I know what you might be asking. Well, okay, but what benefit do I get from that? And here's the benefit that you get. If we come into testitem.tres here, we have this item, okay? But what if we wanted to have another item that does something differently? Well, that is where inheritance will come in. So if we come in here and we right click our res and we click new script like so, and we say this is GD script, it inherits from, and we pick inherits from item. See if this comes up. It probably won't, because I know somebody's going to tell me in the comments again that I did something wrong, but unfortunately I'm too dumb to know. So I'm going to inherit from, I'm going to click on open script, and I'm going to inherit from my scripts item.gd, and I'm going to call this item test2.gd, and I will hit create. Now I'm going to have a second script here called item test2, and you'll see it extends my item.gd. Now here's where things get fun. If I type func use item and I say print used item 2 exclamation point with 2 exclamation points, I can come in here, and this is an overridden function. You can see from this little guy right here. So if I create a resource, let's grab our test item, and I duplicate this guy, and I just name it test item2.tres. I double click on this guy. I can come in here. I can change my reference to this script, and I could say my ID is 2. My name is test item 2, like so. My icon is, let's put a different icon. So let's put a, I don't know if I have any additional icons in here. Do I? I don't think so. So what I'll do is I will put in a new gradient texture, and it'll just be a texture, and we'll say the quantity is 1 and the stack size is 10, and it is stackable. I can basically just have this other item here. So I can come in here and I can go like this. I can come down here. I can grab my add and my remove here. I can do this, and I can add in item 2 and remove item 2. And I can basically take these guys, disconnect them like so, connect them like so. And then I can basically just grab these 2 buttons. So instead of add, underneath button 4, I believe it was button 4 was add. Yep. So button 4, I'll add, and then on button 2, we can do our remove here. So we can pull this guy down here, and we can say test item 2 and test item 2. And then when we hit play, we can add in our 2 items and add in our other items like so. So now if I click, you'll see used item 2 versus used item. So that gives us a lot of flexibility. We can really do pretty much anything we want to do as long as we inherit from that base class. It allows us to basically extend our inventory system. That way we can use items for lots of things. We can also put parameters on some items and not on others, but it gives us a nice reflective way to do things. And then we can also remove from item 2 and remove from item 1, and you'll notice that they're mutually exclusive. They don't pay attention to each other. It's just whatever we want. And we can also swap them, and they're totally fine because they all come from the same base class. So that's the really nice thing about object inheritance and making sure that our code is extendable. So from here, the last thing that I'm going to show you guys is how do we integrate that with our character. Now that's actually going to be pretty simple. So basically all we have to do, if you are not following our horror series, then this doesn't matter to you. You guys can just drop off right now. But to integrate this into our little game here, let's go up to our project settings, and let's come in here and hit add new action and just call inventory. And let's set it to default to the keyboard key of I. Like that. And we'll hit OK. And then we can just come in here and we can go if is action just pressed, quote, inventory, and then we can just show our inventory. Now we'll need to make it so that our inventory exists on our character. So we'll come into our character and we'll just drag our inventory in. So we'll drag this guy up and in. So now we have an inventory. We're going to hide it. Then we'll just say $inventory dot visible is equal to not $inventory dot visible. And that'll basically just flip them to be the opposite. So if it is currently visible, it will hide it. If it's not, then it will show it. And then all we have to do is just check if $inventory dot visible, then we can change our mouse input. If you remember up here, we have our mouse input mode right here. We can just copy this guy, come down here, paste it, and then come in here and say else, paste this, and then come up here and say input dot, and I believe we had a mouse mode visible. We'll do that. And if we're lucky, we can just hit play. So we have our game here. We hit I, and our mouse is no longer captured. You'll see that we do have some issues with our stuff moving around, but we'll figure that out in a minute. We could basically add and remove items into our inventory. We can move it around and stuff like that. Now we do have a issue here. On button click, use item on base nil. Our current item is null. So we'll need to check for that. So if current item does not equal null, to solve that little issue right there. So we'll check for that just to make sure we don't have any crashes there. And we have to fix our character's mouse movement. So we'll come down here and we'll set up a little check. So I'll just pull this if mouse inventory visible. We can come down to our get input. You can see here is where we're setting our inventory movement. So we'll say if our event is mouse motion, and if our inventory is not visible, then we can do that. And then we could just kind of come in here. You could see, well, if I hit the correct play button, you can see I can move around. If I hit I no longer can move around. If I hit I can move around again. And there you go. And that's basically how you create a very simple inventory system. Now, in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over, well, in the next video, I'm going to go with and show you how to do this in C#, but in the video after that, I'm going to go over how we can inspect an object. So we're going to be able to right click and then it's going to pop it up into a 3D viewer, kind of like Resident Evil where you could inspect an object, because I really would like to have the ability where you could pick up an object and rotate it around and then be like, oh, look, there was a key underneath it the whole time or something like that, to help with that element of puzzle solving. So look forward to that. But I think we can leave it here. So if you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. Hey, if you dislike this video, go ahead and hit that dislike button, because I am here to make content for you guys. This video was a viewer suggested video, as with most of my videos. So if you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll be more than happy to check them out. I know some people have asked me to take a look at doing more than just video games. So stuff like maybe an application or perhaps something with Adreno or something like that. So I've been kind of researching a little bit here and there, just checking things out, seeing if there's anything that'd be fun to do. So look forward to that. And hey, if you guys have any questions or comments, throw them in the comments below or hit me up on Discord. Anybody on that Discord will help you out with any issue you might have. We got a bunch of great guys over there, so you can always drop by and say hello. But that is all I have for you guys today. So thank you so much again for watching. I will see you all next time. Thanks.